Everybody, and I see some new faces that have joined us for this portion of the event, so welcome. Um, so glad everyone is here, and I hope you enjoyed the run. I thought it was a lot of fun hearing Anne tell us about each place. I'm going to give Anne's bio again for all of the new people here, so if you heard it, just bear with me for a minute. So Anne is a nonfiction writer with a passion narrative history. Since 2021, she has served as the editor at the Lake Magazine in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Her writing has appeared in the Wisconsin Magazine of History, American Spirit Magazine, and many other local and regional publications. She is the author of Running the Reds, the first 100 years of the Water Safety Patrol, 1920 to 2020. And she's a graduate of Kenyon College, and she splits her time between Chicago and William Bay, Wisconsin. So welcome, Anne, and thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So we heard a lot about the book, and some of you have read the book. And I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and then I'm going to open it for you because I'm sure you have questions as well. So can you tell us more about what inspired you to write this book? I know you mentioned this a little bit.
I mentioned it a little bit, but we do have some newer people. If you didn't do the run and you're joining us now, thank you. Welcome. I really got into this topic because my great-grandfather was the president of the Yellow Cab Company in the 1920s. And I had always heard this story about him, that he started out as a cab driver. He worked his way all the way up to become the president of the Yellow Cab Company. And then he was president for about 2 years. And then on Christmas Day, 1927, he decided to leave his 6 young children and his wife at home. And he decided to go out and go horseback riding in Jackson Park with one of his colleagues from the Yellow Cab Company and his brother-in-law. And I always found the timing suspicious of that. It's Christmas Day. Why are you meeting with a colleague? Why are you leaving your kids at home? But they get their horses all hitched up and they go out into Jackson Park, and we will never know what really happened, because the 2 people he was with always said that they didn't see what happened. But they essentially found him lying beside his horse with a single skull fracture, and he unfortunately passed away. And so there was always this rumor in our family that maybe it wasn't a horse riding accident, maybe it was related to the taxi wars, because this was right at the height of the taxi wars, and there were several other incidents happening around the same time period, although that particular year was a little bit of a quieter year. But if you look back a year, if you look forward a year, there's quite a few incidents along the way that would lead one to suspect that perhaps there was foul play involved. So we never knew for sure, but that always was sort of a rumor in my family. And I decided I wanted to look into it and see if that was even a plausible rumor, or if this was just, sometimes families talk and make things up. So I ended up starting this research project during COVID. And what I discovered was that there were so many incidents in the 1920s related to the taxi wars that I really felt like there should already be a book. And I thought I would love to read this book. But unfortunately, that book didn't exist yet. And they always say to writers, if you can't find the book that you want to read, that means you have to write it. So I ended up researching a little bit more and putting together a book proposal. And from there, I got a book contract. And that is sort of the genesis of this whole project and why we're all here today. So,
thank you. So with that, in regards to your research, what challenges did you face researching for this book? What were your primary resources, and what was surprising as you were researching or unexpected?
Yes, lots of surprising things. So it was a very research-heavy project, I will say. And I say this in the author note, but this book could not have been written until they digitized all of the newspapers. The digitization of newspapers was the single greatest thing that happened that allowed me to research this topic, because you have to be able to keyword search, right? So I started by just keyword searching the words taxi wars, and then I would come across an article, and from that I would see names of people, and then I would start keyword searching those names. And from keyword searching those names, I would get a little bit more of the story. So it wasn't, you wouldn't have been able to know every single incident and which dates to search if you were going to do the research on microfilm or microfiche. You would have just been scanning every newspaper from the 1920s until you found what you were looking for. But with keyword searching, I was able to be really intentional about it. And so that was where I started, and that actually was a huge project. I ended up having to essentially hire a research assistant who was a current student at my alma mater, who wanted to get some experience doing research projects, and so she volunteered her time, and she was absolutely like essential in this process. She did it for a semester, and I could not have finished the book in the amount of time I finished it in without her help. So that was one huge challenge, was just the sheer amount of research and how many different things, and how I kept finding more rabbit holes we had to go down. And I mean, it felt like it was never ending. The other challenge is that it's been 100 years, right? So there are not as many primary resources 100 years later to find. And so I really had to do some creative digging to try and figure out where I could find some of these primary resources. So, for example, the Hotel LaSalle, the manager of the Hotel LaSalle, I mentioned him on the tour. His name was Ernest J. Stevens. I discovered that his family had left all of his papers and all of his family information and his papers to the Chicago History Museum. So I call up the History Museum, and they say, oh yeah, we've got boxes and boxes of his papers. What are you interested in specifically? We can try and narrow it down for you. Well, it turns out they had a box that had all of the original ledgers from the Hotel LaSalle taxi department from 1917 to 1922, just sitting in a box in the basement of the History Museum that I don't think anybody had looked at since it had been donated to them. So I was able to pull that out and see all of their original financials. I was able to find, they actually hired a private investigator to investigate their competition, their rivals. I mean, it was really interesting stuff that I discovered in their boxes. So that was one piece of that puzzle. But along the way, you're thinking, God, I wish that there were still police reports. I wish that there were still court documents. None of those existed anymore for the most part. So one day I was on the phone with my aunt, and she was saying, how's the book going? And I said, it's really frustrating because it's really hard to find primary resources from 100 years ago. And she said, this was about a year into the project. She said, oh, well, I've got a scrapbook in my secretary desk of all of the original Yellow Cab newsletters, employee newsletters from 1919 to 1921. Do you want those? I was like, yeah, I think I do. Thanks. Can you maybe ship those out to me, please? So she sends them out to me, and they were an invaluable piece of history because they put out an employee newsletter that was also sort of like, it was tips for, how to do your job better, and things that they were, protocols they were putting in place at the company. But it would be like, Fernanda and her husband, Fernanda took the week off, and she and her husband and their daughter went on vacation, and this is what they did. It was like the society pages, but for the Yellow Cab Company, right? And so you got a really neat window into what the lives of these cab drivers and these other employees at the Yellow Cab Company, how they spent their time and what their lives were like. So, I mean, little things like that where I would just sort of start asking questions and then talking to people, and then somebody would say, oh, well, have you checked this? And eventually, from all of that, I was able to put together a lot of really interesting information that I don't think anybody had been looking for prior to that point. Cool. Yeah. So what was the third part of your question? Sorry.
What was something surprising or unexpected?
Yeah. So the surprising aspects are just how many incidents there were. Like, I was thinking oh, I have a general sense of okay, I know that this happened in this year, and then a few years later this happened. But really, there are really shocking, violent things happening in the taxi wars every few months for a dozen years, right? So during this time, you could be riding in the back of your cab and just on your way to dinner, and another cab could come up next to yours, and that driver would start shooting at your driver while you're in the back of the cab on your way to dinner, right? I mean, this was not an unheard of thing to have happen back then. The number of just innocent bystanders who were walking by, and a bomb goes off in the pool hall across the street where the checker taxi guys hang out, and they're in the middle of a civil war, so somebody puts a bomb in the pool hall, the pool hall gets blown up, and this poor 19-year-old woman is just walking down the street, and a shard of glass flies and it basically impales her, and she dies from this. I mean, the level of violence that the average Chicagoan was exposed to in conjunction with these taxi wars was truly shocking to me to learn all of those incidents. Yeah.
Sounds like it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I'm going to open it to you. If you have questions, Anne is happy to answer.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
In the book, you also talk about some of the other things happening in the 1920s, like the race riots, I think were referenced, the prohibition, these other things that are kind of creating this heightened environment. Can you talk a little bit about how those other things happening during that time period impacted the taxi wars and just the
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, great question. So people will ask me, like, did other cities have taxi wars, or was this just a Chicago thing? There are other cities that had much smaller versions of the taxi wars, like Baltimore had a smaller version of them. Kansas City actually had a little skirmish related to them. But I really think that the reason that Chicago had such a long sustained period of violence is because of all the other things that were happening in Chicago at the time, right? So we have, racial violence, unfortunately, related to the 1919 race riots and sort of culminated in that at that time. We have that issue going on. We have, we are sort of the epicenter for the rum running that's happening during Prohibition, right? So we have some of the most violent mob criminals in the country are all coming to Chicago from all points all over to come here and sort of capitalize on that. So because of those things that were happening in Chicago at the time, I think it kind of fueled some of the violence and it sort of sustained some of the incidents that were happening in the taxi wars at the time. What's crazy to me is that we then completely forgot that the taxi wars ever even happened because people are so focused on these other things that were happening in Chicago at the time, which were, shocking and dramatic as well, right? But the fact that we sort of almost collectively completely forgot about the taxi wars until somebody starts asking the right questions, and then, oh, well, no, that happened and then put that together. Actually, that was all related. But, most people I talked to did not know anything about the taxi wars. And they might know about specific incidents related to them, but they didn't realize it was part of a bigger thing and that it went on for as long as it did. And, it really was a huge part of the city's life at the time, because cabs were a huge part of the city's life at the time, and we had sort of kind of collectively forgotten about it. So then Uber and Lyft come along and they're like, hey, we don't think we should have to abide by any of these taxi rules. They're antiquated and old and dumb and we don't want to do it. And I think people were kind of like, oh, okay. But it was because they didn't realize that all of those regulations came out of consumer protections that were related to this time period in Chicago surrounding the taxi wars, right? So I felt compelled to tell the story, partly because I'm like, if we forget our history, we're going to be doomed to repeat our history, right? To a certain extent. But yeah.
So one of my favorite parts of the book is that a lot of sort of famous historical figures suddenly appear, and you're like, this is wild.
Yeah.
So like, what was the what I was most surprised by and found most fascinating was the Joe Kennedy thing. But was there for you, like, what do you think? Who was the most surprising historical figure you ran across? You were like, I had no idea.
Yeah.
He had anything to do with this.
Yeah. That's a great question. I will say I was surprised that Joe Kennedy shows up in this story at all, right? Like, you wouldn't think, like, Joe Kennedy of Boston, famously the father of John F. Kennedy, right? Like, you wouldn't think he had anything to do with Chicago history. I wouldn't have thought. But there is a stock market attack that happens on the Yellow Cab Company. And I guess because he sort of, through like mutual friends, gets introduced. So John Hertz gets introduced to Joe Kennedy, and he is explaining the problem, how someone's trying to tank his company's stock value on the New York Stock Exchange. And Joe Kennedy says, oh, well, I have an idea how to fix that. And, if you set me up in a suite at the, I don't know, like the Waldorf Astoria or something in New York for a month, and just like give me free reign, give me a bunch of capital to work with, I can fix this for you, right? And he does, which I was like, all right, like that was a big gamble, right? Like, you're basically like calling in a bunch of favors from your friends to give him enough stock to play with, so that hopefully he can quell this this bear attack that they're doing on the Yellow Cab stock, and he is absolutely successful. But yeah, that was a surprise. I didn't expect him to show. I mean, there were several points along the way where I was like, huh, like that's interesting. Where, I mean, John Hertz is really involved in the sporting world as well, right? Like, he owns a couple of racehorses, one of whom ultimately becomes a Triple Crown winner. So like, there were all these like kind of things that were happening and intersecting with the story that weren't 100% about taxis, but were also very interesting pieces of history and people and information from that era. Yeah. Yeah.
You brought up about the racehorses. Could you talk about like the mysterious circumstances with like the stables and all that?
Yes. So about 9 months after my great-grandfather dies under sort of mysterious circumstances, and it's worth noting that my great-grandfather was best friends with John Hertz, and that is how my great-grandfather rose through the ranks to become the president as quickly as he did, is that he and John Hertz had been best friends from a young age, right? So about 9 months later, John Hertz, one of his hobbies is he breeds racehorses, thoroughbreds for racing purposes. And he has just built a brand new stable to put all of his stud horses in. So he's got like the modern equivalent of millions of dollars of stud horses in one barn on his property. And that barn, there is suddenly a very violent fire that gets out of hand very quickly. One of the trainers does run in and start trying to save some of the horses, thankfully, but 11 horses end up perishing in this fire, one of whom is the presumed Derby contender that they were going to put up the next year for the Kentucky Derby. So this incident, John Hertz very quickly is like, oh no, I think it was just an accident. Like he was very tight-lipped about it. But very quickly, the police and the investigators who were working on it, they come to the conclusion that it was an arson fire. And they never quite figure out exactly who said it or why, but following that fire, John Hertz then keeps getting some death threats to himself and his family. And so it is definitely, even though it was part of his sort of hobby, not his work life, it does sort of feel like an attack directly on his interests. And so that is a key element, I think, in the book as well. Yeah.
Very cool.
Did you get cooperation, or did you try to contact the cab companies? I understood you got the newsletters kind of through a back door, but were the cab companies helpful at all in your research?
So what you'll learn by the end of the book is that the cab companies basically ceased to exist in the form that they were in the 1920s. They ceased to exist in that form by about 1932.
Right.
The current cab companies now, they're almost all affiliation-based models, and almost all of the cabs it's not a corporate structure anymore.
So the yellow cab company you see today is not at all.
It is related in that it is the same name that has essentially, it then gets bought out and then it gets sort of disseminated in other ways. Yeah. But there isn't really a corporate entity that is Yellow Cab that you can go to anymore and ask questions. And there is not really a checker taxi that you can go to anymore.
Have archives for you.
Right. There is a really active group on the internet called the Internet Checker Taxi Archive, and it's a bunch of car guys who are really into checker taxi. I mean, checker taxi, it existed up until 1980 in various forms, and they made their own cars up until 1980. So there are still people who collect those cars. There are people who are deep into the checker taxi history, but they're all sort of just interested people, volunteers. It's not a corporate-based organization at all. Yeah. Yeah.
One of the things I found really interesting about the book is checkered cabs gets created, and almost immediately, at least it seems from the book, that the employees of yellow taxis are using violence against checker. And I was wondering, did yellow taxi hire criminals, or was it just regular people, or is that how business was done in the 1950s?
Just normal.
So I do think if you go back, even before Checker gets formed in 1922, if you go back to the late 19-teens, I think that was a challenge, was finding quality employees who were not of the criminal element. And so I think when they first start Yellow in 1915, from that point forward to about 1920, there are some bad apples that get in there, and that they're probably the ones who are starting the violence, right? They do then make a very concerted effort at Yellow Cab to professionalize the career of being a cab driver. So Yellow Cab pioneers the use of stock options, as I mentioned. They have all these employee perks. They make it a really desirable position to have. And so by the time Checker comes on the case, Yellow Cab has really cleaned itself up and is doing better. What you'll find then is that Checker is just a loose affiliation of a bunch of people who own their own cars and claim Checker affiliation. So you find all kinds in the Checker organization. So I would argue that once Checker comes on the scene, they are really more so the instigators, and they then devolve into this whole civil war at Checker that Yellow has nothing to do with. Yellow doesn't want anything to do with any of that. So by the time Checker comes on the scene, Yellow Cab has really cleaned up its act and is really trying to professionalize the cab industry, and Checker is kind of the opposite at that point, where they are very rough and tumble and they are out being the aggressors more often, I would say. So, and I think that was a kind of a thorn in John Hertz's side, because here he'd done all this work to try and professionalize the cab industry and improve people's perception of riding in cabs. And then here comes Checker, and they are really undercutting what he's trying to do with that. So, yeah, I think if you asked if we could resurrect my great grandfather and put him down here right now, I think he would be very upset to think that people conflate yellow cab post 1920 with Checker taxi, because to him they were, it was a completely different group of people and a completely different company ethic, and what they were trying to accomplish at Yellow Cab was very forward thinking and visionary, and Checker was just basically trying to take as much of the pie as they could. So yeah. Oh, hi.
Hi. Well, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more. I know I've heard snippets of this, but about relatives of the people who you write about the book, their reactions to the book, and like different conversations you've had with people who are the descendants of these people.
Yeah, so I did a little bit try to reach out to as many people as I could when I was working on the book, and I had an incident that happened early on when I had finished my last book about the Water Safety Patrol. I was at the book release party for that book, which was hosted at a beautiful lakefront home on Lake Geneva, and the lady who hosted it, her adult son was also at the party. And he was asking me, well, what's your next book going to be about? That's the first question you will get the minute you publish a book, by the way. As soon as your book comes out, they don't want to know what that book is about. They want to know what your next book is going to be about. So her adult son said to me, what's your next book going to be? And I said, well, I've always kind of wanted to write a book about the taxi wars. And most people, when I would say those words, they had no recognition of this concept at all. They were like, what are the taxi wars? Never heard of this. This gentleman's face absolutely lit up. And he was like, oh my gosh, my great-grandfather co-founded the Yellow Cab Company in Chicago. So it turned out that I was actually in the home of the granddaughter and great-grandson of Walden Shaw, who was John Hertz's partner initially, who they founded the Yellow Cab Company together. So they were actually really helpful. I was able to interview Joy, was her name. I was able to interview Joy. I was able to get access to some history and research that they had done about their ancestors' businesses and how he got started. And that helped fill in a lot of the holes for some of the early chapters, actually. So it was wonderful. They've been super supportive, and they've been really, really lovely to work with. But I did try to reach out. I tried to see if there were any Hertz descendants, and to the best of my knowledge, I think there are, but they're not really that connected to the family history anymore, and they're not in Chicago, and so I didn't have any luck with that. But since the book has come out now, I've been getting letters and people reaching out to me who do have connections to people in the book. So just recently I had an email from the granddaughter of a man named Frank Sexton, who is one of the Checker guys on the Union side of Checker who ends up getting murdered. And it's like a really dramatic story where he gets murdered, and then his father shows up at the courthouse and ends up shooting the guy who shot his son. And it's like a whole dramatic incident. And his granddaughter is still alive and just reached out to me and said, oh my gosh, I can't wait to read this book. We've heard of the story in our family all our lives, but this is the first time anyone's ever written about it. And I said, well, I understand where you're coming from, because I felt the same way about my family history as well. So it's been neat to finally kind of have, now that it's out in the world, to have people able to come back and share their stories and share their families' perspectives on everything. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, does anybody have any last pending questions before we transition into Anne's signing book?
Well, I'm going to ask the question that she gets asked. What's your next book?